There lived a husband and wife. For a long time they already wanted to have a child, but he was not there. One day, my wife fell ill. The husband asked her what she wants the most. The wife replied that there was a magnificent garden nearby, where many of the most beautiful flowers grow. There is a beautiful Rapunzel in the garden. It looked so fresh and so green that she really wanted to taste it. But the garden was surrounded by a high fence, and no one dared to enter it, since this garden belonged to one witch. She possessed great power, and everyone in the world feared her. The husband loved his wife very much, and decided to get a Rapunzel for her, no matter what it cost him. And so at dusk he climbed over the stone fence into the sorceress's garden, in a hurry picked up a whole handful of green Rapunzel, and brought it to his wife. She immediately made herself a salad from it, and ate greedily. She liked this salad so much that the next day she wanted even more than before. The husband made his way into the garden again, but the witch was already standing in front of him. She glared at him angrily and said that he would pay a lot for stealing the Rapunzel. He asked the witch not to be angry, because he tore off the Rapunzel for his wife, who was very ill. And he loves her so much.
Okay.
The witch's anger passed a little, and she said that if it was true, she would allow him to collect as much Rapunzel as he wanted, but on one condition. He will have to give the witch the child who will be born to his wife. The husband agreed with fear. When the wife gave birth to a daughter, the witch immediately appeared, took the child with her, and named her Rapunzel. Rapunzel became the most beautiful girl in the world. When she was 12 years old, the witch locked her in a tower. That tower was in the forest, and it had no doors or stairs. Only at the very top was a small window. When the witch wanted to climb the tower, she called Rapunzel to pull her sides down. And Rapunzel had long, beautiful hair. She hears the voice of the witch, loosens her braids, ties them up to the window hook, and the hair falls down, and the witch then climbs up, clinging to them.
Hello.
Several years passed, and the king's son happened to ride a horse through the forest where the tower stood. Suddenly he heard singing, and it was so pleasant that he stopped and began to listen. Rapunzel sang it in her wonderful voice. The prince wanted to climb up. He began to look for the entrance to the tower, but it was impossible to find him. He once saw how the witch climbs up the braids that Rapunzel lowered her. And the next day, when it was already getting dark, the prince drove up to the tower and called Rapunzel. She heard, pulled her braids down, and the prince climbed up. Rapunzel, seeing that a man she had never seen came to her, was very frightened at first. But the prince spoke to her affectionately and said that his heart was so touched by the singing that he decided to see her without fail. Then Rapunzel ceased to be afraid, and when he asked if she agreed to marry him, she gave her consent and held out her hand to him. But they just did not know how to go down together. They figured out that when the prince came, he would always take a piece of silk with him, and Rapunzel would weave a ladder out of it. And when the ladder is ready, they will go down it together and leave. The sorceress did not notice anything until one day Rapunzel asked why it is easier to drag the prince up. The sorceress understood everything, got angry and clutched in rage at Rapunzel's beautiful hair. I wrapped them around my left arm several times, and with my right grabbed the scissors and cut them off. She took the sorceress into the dense thicket of Rapunzel and hid her there. She tied the severed braids to the window hook, and when the prince appeared, she pulled them down. The prince climbed up and saw the witch. She looked at him with her malicious look and said that he would never see Rapunzel. The king's son was beside himself with grief and jumped out of the tower in despair, but the thorny thorns of the bushes, on which he fell, gouged out his eyes. The blind prince wandered for several years in grief and sorrow through the forest, all the time grieving and crying for his beloved lost. Once he went into a dense thicket. Suddenly the prince heard someone singing. It seemed so familiar to him, and he went to meet him. When he came closer, Rapunzel recognized him, threw herself on his neck and cried bitterly with joy. 2 tears fell in his eyes, and the prince regained his sight and began to see as before. He brought her to his kingdom, and they lived for many, many years in happiness and joy.
A long time ago, a beautiful princess lived in a large castle. And then one day her father gave her a golden balloon for her birthday. The princess liked the gift so much that she spent all her time with it. On one of these days, the girl went out to play with a ball in the garden. But having played, she did not notice how she ended up near the pond. The princess threw the ball up and tried to catch it. But he slipped out of her hands, rolled on the grass and fell straight into the pond. The princess tried to get the ball, but it was at the very bottom. Then the girl had no choice but to sit by the pond and cry bitterly. But then a noise was heard from the grass. The princess looked back and saw a frog in front of her. She looked at the girl and asked why the princess was crying. The girl was very surprised to see a talking frog, and told her how she dropped the ball into the water. The frog listened attentively, jumped around the pond and invited the girl to return the ball. But in return she asked to fulfill one request, to make friends with the frog and take her to the palace. After a short thought, the princess agreed. Then the frog jumped into the water and disappeared from sight. Soon she appeared with a golden ball and threw it to the princess. Having received her gift back, the princess happily ran to the palace. Then the frog reminded the girl of their agreement. But the princess just laughed and said that such an ugly frog could not live in a palace. So, the girl left the frog and returned to the castle. In the evening, the king, queen and princess gathered for dinner. But as soon as they started eating, they heard a knock at the door. Then the butler entered the room and announced that a frog was sitting at the threshold. She asks permission to enter and claims that she was invited by the princess. The king looked sternly at his daughter. And the princess told him about everything that happened in the morning by the pond. The father thought about it, and then said that if the princess promised something, she should keep her word. Then the king ordered the butler to let the frog in. The door opened and a small frog entered the castle. In several leaps, she found herself at the table. The frog then bowed to the king and thanked him for allowing her to enter. After that, the frog jumped to the princess's plate. The king ordered a saucer to be brought to the guest. But the frog stopped him and said that he could eat from the princess's plate. The girl was beside herself with rage. But she didn't show it, hoping that after supper the frog would leave the palace. However, when the princess got up from the table, the frog followed her. And after a while, the guest wanted to sleep. The princess offered her a guest room. But the frog said that it wants to sleep in the girl's bed. And the princess, fearing to disappoint her father, agreed. Then the frog jumped onto the king's bed and rested its head on the soft pillow. And the princess had to lie down next to her. In the morning, the frog woke the girl up and said that she had a last wish, after which she would definitely leave. And the heart of the princess was filled with hope. The frog paused, looked into the girl's eyes, and then asked to kiss her frog lips. The princess jumped out of bed in a rage and flatly refused to kiss the nasty frog. And the guest, hearing this, wept bitterly. Suddenly the princess felt so sorry for the poor frog that she had no choice but to kiss her. As soon as the princess did this, a bright light lit up the room. A moment later, when the light went out, in front of her was no longer a frog, but a handsome prince. He said that once an evil witch put a curse on him. And to break the spell, he needed to spend the day with the princess and get a kiss from her. The astonished princess was happy. They went to the king together and then got married. And they lived happily ever after. And the princess never again judged people by their appearance.